Kofi had always lived in a small, cozy village on the outskirts of a large African country. Everyone knew each other there, and the boy felt at home. Every day passed in a familiar rhythm. He helped his parents on the farm, played with friends in the meadow, which seemed endless to him, and rejoiced in every little thing. But one day his usual life changed. Kofi's father got a job in another village, a larger and more developed one. This was good news for the family, but for Kofi it meant one thing: goodbye to his old life. As they packed their belongings that day, the boy stood at the window and looked out at the village that was soon to be only a memory. It was hard for him to realize that he would have to leave the place where his entire childhood had passed.
"Kofi, son, come on, help us with our things,"
came his mother's voice. Kofi reluctantly moved away from the window and began to gather his things. He didn't want to leave this house, this village where so many things were so familiar and loved. But he knew he had no choice. A few hours later, the family was on their way to the new village. The journey was long, and during that time Kofi didn't utter a word. He thought about what the new school would be like, whether he would make new friends, and how he would cope with all the changes. When he arrived in the new village, Kofi felt even more alone. The village was bigger and busier than his home village. The streets were crowded, unfamiliar houses stood next to each other, and the boy lost all sense of security. Their new home wasn't as cozy as the previous one, and Kofi couldn't get used to his new surroundings. The next morning he was awakened by his mother reminding him that it was time to get ready for his new school. Kofi struggled to get out of bed, feeling a growing uneasiness. He knew this day was going to be a tough one. When he entered the classroom, all eyes turned to him. The teacher, an elderly woman with a kind face, introduced him to the class.
"Children, we have a new student. This is Kofi. He has come from another village, so please be kind to him and help him settle in."
But instead of kind looks and words of encouragement, Kofi felt cold stares. The children were whispering among themselves, eyeing his clothes and his dull briefcase, which was already worn out. The boy sat down at the last desk and tried not to pay attention to the whispers behind him. The first recess began with several boys approaching him. One of them, obviously the leader of the group, started a conversation.
"Hey, what's your name?"
he asked with a sneer in his voice, even though he remembered the newcomer's name perfectly well.
"Kofi,"
he answered quietly, trying not to look them in the eye.
"Listen, Kofi, you're from some backwoods village, aren't you? It's different here. It's going to be hard for you," the leader said with a smirk.
"I'll try."
Kofi mumbled, not knowing what to say.
"You'll try, ha."
The boys laughed.
"Let's see how you do."
With those words they turned and walked away, leaving Kofi standing there confused. He couldn't understand why they were acting this way. After all, he hadn't done anything wrong to anyone.
"Maybe in time they'll accept me,"
Kofi thought, trying to calm himself down. After class, when all the students started to go home, Kofi walked slowly down the road, thinking about how tomorrow would go. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he also realized that he needed to adapt and try to find his place in this new environment. That evening at home, he told his mother about his impressions of the first day of school. She listened to him carefully, stroked his head, and said,
"Don't worry, son. Wherever you go, it will be difficult at first. But you are a smart boy, and I am sure that in time everything will get better. The main thing is to be patient and don't give up."
Kofi nodded, but there was still a feeling of unease in his heart. He didn't know what was in store for him next, but he was determined not to show his fear. The next day began much like the previous day. Kofi tried to keep a low profile, but it seemed that his presence always attracted attention. His classmates continued to tease him, but he tried not to react. At lunch recess, however, Kofi encountered another unpleasant situation. He was sitting alone at the table when the same boy and his group approached him again.
"What, Kofi, no one wants to sit with you?"
he asked snidely.
"I just want to be alone."
Kofi replied quietly, feeling a lump forming in his throat.
"Alone? No one wants you."
Another boy in the group said, and everyone laughed again. Kofi felt his eyes fill with tears, but he held back and just lowered his head. He felt ashamed that he couldn't stand up for himself, and that made it even worse. He knew he had to do something about it, but he didn't know what. The evening of the day Kofi came home, his father noticed that something was wrong with his son.
Kofi, what's wrong? You seem depressed.
He asked worriedly.
At school.
Kofi started to say something, but he stopped talking. He didn't want his parents to worry.
It's okay, Dad. It's just hard to get used to.
His father looked at his son carefully, then walked over to him and put his hand on his shoulder.
I know this isn't easy for you right now. But remember, Kofi, every journey begins with a first step. You can overcome all the difficulties. The main thing is not to lose faith in yourself.
Kofi nodded, although inside he still felt lonely and misunderstood. He knew there were challenges ahead of him, but now he was determined to overcome them. Even though tomorrow at school still made him anxious, he promised himself that he would do his best to find his place in this new world. The first day at his new school left Kofi with an oppressive feeling. His classmates were clearly not in the mood for friendship. The boy came home with a heavy heart, but he tried not to show his worries to his parents. He already realized that his position in the class would not be easy, and he would have to prove that he was not as weak and alien as they thought. The next morning, as he approached the schoolyard, Kofi saw that most of the students had already gathered and were discussing something. He noticed a few of the boys in his class whispering and chuckling, peering in his direction. Kofi clutched the straps of his briefcase and took a deep breath, preparing himself for his second day at his new school. When the bell rang, the boy walked into the classroom and sat down at his desk. The entire class immediately fell silent as he walked in and then whispered with renewed vigor. He could feel dozens of eyes on him. A few minutes later, the teacher entered the classroom and the lesson began. Kofi tried to concentrate on his studies, but he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was always looking at him. Soon the first break came. Kofi remained in his seat, flipping through his textbook, though his thoughts were far away. Suddenly, one of his classmates approached him. It was a tall boy with a cocky expression who had been introduced yesterday as Kenu.
Hey, Kofi.
Ken said, leaning closer.
Where are you from anyway? You have such a weird accent.
Kofi looked up, trying to remain calm.
I'm from a small village up north. We recently moved here.
He replied, feeling the anxiety building in his chest. Ken grinned and nodded to his buddies, who stood a little further away, clearly encouraging him to continue.
Ah, I see. Well, that explains your clothes.
Ken said, examining Kofi's old shirt and pants, which clearly bore the marks of years of use.
There aren't many stores in our village.
Kofi started to justify himself, but Ken interrupted him.
Hey. Of course, everyone here knew you were from the middle of nowhere. You can talk like a hillbilly. Look, it's different in the city. You're a stranger here, okay?
Ken looked at his friends and they giggled.
I just want to study and make friends.
Kofi replied quietly, trying not to look Ken in the eye. He could feel his face starting to burn with shame and resentment. Ken was apparently not satisfied with this reaction. He decided to push even harder.
Friends? Who needs you around here except for a laugh? Look at you, Kofi, looking like that. You'd be a laughingstock. No one will want to be friends with you until you start acting like a normal person.
He said, still grinning mockingly.
Normal? What does that mean?
Kofi didn't expect himself to ask that. He knew he couldn't fit into this new world if he didn't understand its rules. Ken hesitated for a moment, but quickly came up with an answer.
It means being like us. Don't stand out, don't draw attention to yourself. And so far you look like a total loser. Even your teacher noticed that you're weird.
He said, deliberately exaggerating the situation. Kofi fell silent, not knowing what to say in response. He realized that Ken and his friends weren't going to accept him, and his heart squeezed with loneliness.
All right, that's enough of that, Ken.
Suddenly intervened another boy in the group, whose name was Thibault.
Let him sit and learn his country ways. It's hard enough for him as it is.
Ken snorted derisively, but waved his hand.
All right, Kofi, we'll talk to you again. Maybe you'll understand how things work around here.
With those words they turned and walked away, leaving Kofi deeply confused. The boy lowered his head, feeling even stranger in the school. He couldn't get used to not being accepted here. It was different in his home village. There, despite the simplicity of life, everyone was friendly and supportive. But here, in this new, unfamiliar environment, it seemed no one was going to be his friend. A couple more classes passed, and Kofi tried to focus on his studies, but thoughts of his unpleasant classmates kept coming back. He could feel the fear building up inside of him before each break, because each time he expected more ridicule and bullying. At lunch recess, Kofi found himself alone again. He took his food and sat at the farthest table in the dining hall, hoping he wouldn't be noticed. But no sooner had he started eating than two girls from his class came up to him. They were Leah and Amanda, who had already exchanged a few mocking glances with Ken yesterday.
Hi, Kofi. Then and
Leah began, leaning on the table across from him.
do you always eat alone?
Kofi lifted his head and looked at her. She didn't sound as hostile as he'd heard from Ken, but there was still something unpleasant in her tone.
I'm just more comfortable this way.
He answered, trying to speak calmly.
You know, that's not the way it works here. We all eat in company.
Amanda intervened, smiling, but there was something cold in her smile.
I just don't know anyone here yet.
Kofi felt himself getting nervous again.
Well, it's understandable. You're new.
Leah said, glancing at his food.
Look, you don't think you can live like this all through high school, do you?
I don't know.
Kofi shrugged. He could feel the lump building up in his throat.
We can show you how things work here.
Amanda said suddenly, and Leah nodded in agreement. Kofi thought for a moment. Perhaps this was a chance to make at least a few friends. But something about their behavior made him doubt it. He couldn't tell if they were sincere in their offer or just playing him like a cat and mouse.
Thank you, but I want to handle this myself.
He said politely, though he wasn't sure what he meant. The girls looked at each other and shrugged.
Well, as you wish. Just don't complain about being alone.
Leah said with a note of warning in her voice, and they both left. Kofi was left alone again, feeling the pressure from his classmates slowly building up. He realized that if he didn't start adjusting, it would only get harder for him. But how? How could he become part of this collective if he was not accepted? After school, on his way home, Kofi tried to find answers to these questions. It was difficult for him, and he didn't know how to handle the situation. But one thought kept coming back to him: don't give up. He realized that if he gave up every time he faced a difficulty, he would never be able to accomplish anything in life. When he got home, his mum asked him how his day was.
It was fine.
He replied, trying not to show his anxiety. But she noticed that her son was depressed and approached him.
Kofi, I can see that it's hard for you. But remember, you're stronger than you think. Time will sort things out, she said softly, putting her arms around him.
Kofi nodded. He knew there were still many difficult days ahead, but he was determined not to give up. He had to prove to himself and others that he was not just an outsider, but a full-fledged student at this school who deserved respect and friendship. After the first few days at the new school, Kofi began to realize that the adaptation would be much more difficult than he had expected. The hostility he encountered did not disappear, but on the contrary, only intensified. Over the next weeks, the situation began to deteriorate rapidly. If at first he was simply teased because of his accent and clothes, now his classmates were deliberately trying to make his life more difficult, making it unbearable. Every morning when he woke up, Kofi felt a weight of anxiety constricting his thoughts. He knew that the day would be full of challenges that he would have to overcome alone. It wasn't just teasing that awaited him at school, but real bullying. Classmates were banding together to come up with new ways to humiliate and hurt him. At first, they started by simply ignoring him. During recess, when other kids would gather in groups and socialize, Kofi would be left alone. No one wanted to sit next to him at the same desk or share textbooks. Even in class, when the teacher asked questions of the whole class, they seemed to ignore him, whispering among themselves and glancing at him when he tried to answer something. This emotional coldness created an invisible wall around Kofi that grew higher and higher every day. The bullying then escalated into more active forms of aggression. Every day, Kofi faced new jokes from his classmates. For example, when he sat down at his desk, his chair would be smeared with soap, causing him to fall over, causing the whole class to cackle. His textbooks were often missing or scribbled with offensive words. One day he found his notebooks torn out and scattered around the classroom, with ink on the pages. He had to rewrite all the assignments, and the teacher, not knowing the real reason, thought it was just his carelessness. Even worse, the bullying didn't stop at school. Returning home, Kofi would sometimes find his path blocked by the same classmates. They would push him, laugh, take his backpack and throw it in the dirt, and sometimes even swing to hit him. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the humiliation he felt when he saw their satisfied faces. Especially hard for him was the case when in one of the lessons on physical education, in front of everyone, he was tripped up and he fell down, hitting hard. Everyone immediately laughed and no one offered to help. The teacher didn't even notice what had happened as he was busy explaining the exercise. At that moment, Kofi felt an unbearable desire to disappear, so that no one would ever see his humiliation again. Over time, Kofi became withdrawn and silent. He avoided talking and tried not to draw attention to himself, but this only fueled the interest of his classmates, who saw his silence as weakness and fear. They found new ways to hurt him. For example, one of the boys in their class began spreading rumors that Kofi was bringing strange and dirty things to school, hinting at his village origins. These rumors spread quickly, and soon even those children who had not previously participated in bullying began to be suspicious of him. One day was particularly difficult for Kofi when he arrived at school and found his seat at his desk completely splattered with paint. His textbooks and notebooks were ruined, and a crude insult had been written on his desk. This was the final straw. Kofi could hardly hold back his tears, feeling completely broken and alone. At that moment, he even considered not coming to school anymore, but realized that wasn't an option. Deep down, he knew he couldn't just run away from the problem. The psychological pressure he felt on a daily basis was beginning to take its toll on his physical state. He lost his appetite and began to sleep poorly. Kofi was constantly thinking about what was going on and had no way out. His parents, seeing that something was wrong with their son, tried to talk to him, but he didn't want to tell them what was going on. He felt like they wouldn't understand him, or worse, would blame him for not being able to handle the situation. Kofi decided to shut himself off and try to find a way to get through it all on his own. The psychological tension began to build. Every time he felt he couldn't take it anymore, he remembered his mother's words that time would sort things out. But every day it became harder and harder to believe it. Sometimes, lying in bed at night, Kofi thought about why this was happening to him. He was kind, trying not to hurt anyone, but despite that, his life had become a nightmare. The more time passed, the more desperate Kofi's situation became. He realized that if the situation did not change, he might not be able to stand it. Thoughts of running away from school, or even the village, began to cross his mind more and more often. But he realized that this was not a solution. Kofi began to think about how to change the situation, how to stop the bullying. One of the hardest things for Kofi was the realization that he was in complete isolation. Even the few students who did not participate in the bullying stayed away from him, fearing that if they began to socialize with him, they too would become targets for ridicule. At times like this, Kofi felt more alone than ever. It seemed to him that the whole world was against him and no one wanted to help him. The bullying from his classmates began to take new, even more subtle forms. One rainy day, Kofi discovered that his backpack had been taken outside and left out in the rain. His books and notebooks were soaked through. Kofi struggled to hold back the tears as he gathered his things and tried to somehow salvage what could still be salvaged. He couldn't understand what he had done wrong to deserve such hatred. His whole being resisted the idea that people could be so cruel simply because he wasn't like them. As the weeks went by, Kofi was beginning to lose faith that things would ever change. His inner world began to crumble, and he felt like he was on the verge of complete emotional exhaustion. Each new day brought new challenges, and Kofi felt himself sinking further and further into the abyss of despair. But despite all of this, deep down Kofi continued to believe that he could find a way out. Somewhere inside him lived a small spark of hope that kept him from finally breaking down. He knew he had to find a way to cope, to overcome this horror and show everyone that he wasn't as weak as they thought. And although there were still many difficulties ahead of him, he realized that this ordeal was only a temporary stage in his journey, and sooner or later he would find the strength to change his life. At some point, when the bullying from his classmates became unbearable for Kofi, he decided that he could no longer handle the situation alone. His mental strength was running low, and he needed to find someone who could help. His first thought was to turn to the teachers. He hoped that adults could see what was happening and stop it. The next day, upon arriving at school, Kofi felt strangely excited. All the way to school in the morning, he rehearsed in his head how to address the teacher. He knew he had to pick the right moment when no one was in the classroom, so no one would hear their conversation. Finally, choosing a moment between classes, he approached his class teacher, Ms. Dalima, who was just sorting notebooks. Kofi plucked up his courage and began to talk about what was going on at school. He didn't talk about everything at once, trying not to be too emotional, but he tried to explain how much he was tormented by the ridicule and bullying from his classmates. He expected that Miss Dalimu would react with understanding and sympathy, that she would see in his words not just childish complaints, but a real problem that required intervention. However, the teacher's reaction was completely unexpected. Ms. Dalimu, after listening to him, only grinned and said that children were always a little cruel to each other, especially the newcomers. She advised Kofi to ignore the petty nastiness and focus on his studies. In her opinion, they were just normal childish jokes that would eventually pass when his classmates got used to his presence. Kofi was stunned. He couldn't believe that his suffering had been taken so lightly. He tried again to explain that what was happening was beyond the usual jokes, but Ms. Dalimu seemed to have already lost interest in the conversation. She assured him that the situation was not as serious as he thought and that everything would work itself out. His heart clenched with disappointment. For the first time since arriving at this school, he had the courage to ask for help, but all he got were empty words. Realizing that the teacher wasn't going to intervene, Kofi felt even more alone and lost. He returned to his seat with a sense of hopelessness, feeling his hope for a solution fading. For a few days after that, Kofi tried to come to terms with the situation, trying to follow Ms. Dalimu's advice and ignore the bullying. However, this proved impossible. The bullying continued, and each day brought new humiliation. His patience began to wear thin, and he felt increasingly unable to cope with the situation on his own. So he decided to go to another teacher, this time Mr. Aboa, the math teacher. He was stricter and seemed fair. Kofi hoped that this teacher could take his words seriously, but here too disappointment awaited him. Mr. Aboa seemed too busy with the learning process to pay attention to one student's complaints. He only threw Kofi a couple of catchphrases about how school is a place where children learn to interact with each other, and that they need to learn to find common ground with their classmates. Instead of support, Kofi received another confirmation that none of the teachers took his problems seriously. His despair grew every day. He felt more and more cornered. The teachers he went to for help didn't see anything serious in what he was saying. They thought it was just a childish problem that didn't require intervention. To them, it was just a normal school socialization process, and they believed that Kofi should be able to handle it on his own. Realizing that he could not find support at school, Kofi decided to turn to his family. He hoped that his parents would understand his pain and help him find a solution. But even here, he was disappointed. When Kofi cautiously began to tell his parents about what was happening at school, they listened but did not pay much attention to what he was saying. His father, a stern and confident man, said that such difficulties were part of growing up, and that Kofi had to learn to be strong. His mother, though concerned, also advised him to be patient and ignore petty grievances. His parents assured him that things would get better with time. They said that Kofi just needed to get used to the new school and find a way to get along with his classmates. His father even recalled his own school years when he faced similar problems and how he overcame them, becoming stronger. In his opinion, these difficulties would build Kofi's character and make him more independent. However, Kofi felt that his parents' words, despite their intention to help, did not reflect the seriousness of his situation. He found it difficult to accept the idea that adults could not see how difficult his situation was. He could not understand why his suffering was perceived as something normal and passing. The lack of support from his family was another blow to him. He was left alone with his problems, and this loneliness was beginning to become unbearable. Soon Kofi began to withdraw more and more into himself. He no longer saw the point in sharing his worries with anyone, knowing that no one would take them seriously. He could feel an invisible wall growing between him and the people around him, shutting him off from the outside world. At school, He tried to be as inconspicuous as possible, avoiding conflicts and trying not to draw attention to himself. But despite this, the bullying continued, and Kofi felt that he was on the edge of his abilities. His inner world became increasingly filled with bitterness and resentment. He began to feel a sense of injustice to himself and his life. It seemed to him that the world had turned against him, and no one wanted to help him. This feeling of despair and helplessness became a constant companion of his days. He stopped enjoying the things that used to bring him pleasure. His whole existence became a struggle with himself and with those who hurt him. Kofi felt anger and resentment growing inside him more and more. These feelings began to fill his thoughts, preventing him from focusing on anything good. He knew he couldn't live like this anymore, but he didn't know how to change the situation. Thoughts of running away from school, or even leaving home altogether, began to cross his mind more and more often. It seemed to him that the only way to stop suffering was to just disappear, to go somewhere where no one could get him. At this time, he began to think that perhaps he himself was to blame for what was happening to him. These thoughts tormented him and destroyed his self-esteem. It seemed to him that if he had been different, if he had been able to fit in better, things would have been different. He felt like an outsider not only at school, but also in his own family. This internal conflict was tearing him apart, robbing him of the last remnants of his self-confidence. Yet despite all this, Kofi continued to go to school, as if he were fulfilling a duty that could not be avoided. Every day was a test that he had to pass over and over again. He no longer hoped for help, but in the back of his mind there was still hope that someday things would change, that one day he would be understood and accepted for who he was. But with each passing day, that hope grew weaker and weaker. Eventually, Kofi came to the realization that he would have to find a way out of this situation on his own. He realized that he could no longer rely on help from adults who couldn't see his real pain. He had to find the strength to overcome all the difficulties and protect himself from bullying. A plan began to form in his soul: how to change his life, how to fight back against those who had caused him so much suffering. It was the idea that he had to find a way to cope with the situation, even if no one would help him. After all attempts to find support and help had failed, Kofi felt lonelier than ever. Fear, anger, and deep frustration raged in his soul. But at some point, when he was almost ready to give up, a new and unexpected source of strength awoke inside him. Finding himself without any outside help, Kofi realized that the only person he could rely on was himself. This realization led to the beginning of his inner transformation. At first, this was difficult to accept. Kofi was used to thinking that in a difficult situation, he could always find someone to lend a helping hand. However, reality showed him that he was alone in this struggle. Gradually, this thought stopped scaring him and instead began to give him confidence. He realized that he had strength and capabilities that he didn't even know he had. One of the first steps toward inner transformation was Kofi's decision to change his attitude. Previously, he had perceived bullying as something that humiliated and broke him. Now, however, he decided that he would no longer be a victim. He began to see every confrontation with his classmates as an opportunity to try his strength and test his stamina. It became a challenge of sorts for him, which he accepted with determination. Kofi realized that he needed to develop a confidence that could protect him from being attacked by his classmates. He began to look for ways to strengthen his inner self. During this period, he turned to sports, which had always been of interest to him but had not previously occupied a significant place in his life. He began regular running and strength training, finding it not only a way to improve his physical condition, but also a stress reliever. Every time Kofi went for a run, he could feel his body and mind getting stronger. He began to notice that each day he was finding it easier to deal with fatigue and pain, and this physical hardening was gradually spilling over into his mental state. Another important point in his transformation was the discovery of his creative abilities. Kofi had always loved to draw, but had never given it much thought before. Now he found it not only a comfort, but also a way to express his feelings. When he drew, his soul was soothed and he could put into form his emotions that would otherwise be difficult to put into words. The colors and lines on paper became a kind of therapy for him to cope with his inner conflicts and pain. Over time, his drawings became more complex and emotionally intense, reflecting the changes that were taking place in his soul. Drawing helped him find inner balance and see the world from a different, brighter perspective. In addition, Kofi discovered his ability to solve complex problems and challenges. He began to use this skill to find solutions to situations that seemed hopeless. This skill became his weapon in dealing with the bullying of his classmates. Instead of simply reacting to their actions, he began to think his moves ahead, planning how to avoid or turn conflicts in his favor. His strategic thinking skills gradually began to pay off, and his classmates began to notice that Kofi was no longer easily intimidated. Over time, the changes that were taking place inside Kofi began to be reflected in his behavior and appearance. He became more confident, his movements more purposeful and calm. There was a hardness in his gaze that said he was no longer afraid. His classmates noticed this change, and their attitudes towards him began to gradually change. Although they were still trying to hurt him, they were no longer as confident as before. Kofi was no longer giving them the reaction they expected. Instead of fear and helplessness, they saw before them a man who was willing to stand up for himself and would not allow himself to be humiliated. However, the changes were not just on an external level. Kofi began to feel a new strength growing inside him that allowed him to see the world from a different perspective. He stopped seeing hardships as punishment or injustice and began to see them as opportunities for growth and self-improvement. He met each new challenge with willingness and determination, knowing that it made him stronger. Gradually, this inner transformation began to take its toll. Kofi began to feel more and more confident and calm. His fears began to recede. He realized that no one but himself could solve his problems, and this realization gave him strength. He stopped being the victim he had been in the beginning and began to become a man in control of his own destiny. Kofi also began to spend more time studying, finding it a way to prove to himself and others that he was capable of more. He became better at his assignments, his grades improved, and his teachers noticed this progress. Although he wasn't looking for recognition, it gave him even more confidence in his abilities. Studying became another arena for him to showcase his talents and abilities. Especially significant for Kofi was the realization that his strength was not only in his physical fitness or mental ability, but also in his ability to control his emotions. He learned not to give in to provocation, not to let anger or resentment overwhelm him. Instead, he began to use his emotions as a source of energy, channeling them toward his goals. This ability to control himself became one of the key factors in his transformation. Kofi began to realize that true power lies in the ability to keep his cool and act reasonably, even in the most difficult situations. Over time, Kofi's changes became evident not only to himself, but also to those around him. His confidence, calmness, and determination began to attract attention. Even those classmates who had previously mocked him began to treat him with respect, even if they didn't admit it out loud. Kofi understood that not all problems could be solved by force, but he realized that the changes in his inner world had made him stronger and more independent. He no longer feared loneliness or hardship because he knew he had what it took to face any challenge. This period of inner transformation was a time of self-discovery for Kofi. He found qualities in himself that he had not even suspected before. He realized that it is not only physical fitness or the ability to stand up for oneself that makes one strong, but also inner stability, confidence, and the ability to overcome difficulties. All of this made Kofi not only stronger, but wiser. He realized that life is full of challenges, and it is up to him how he gets through them. These trials helped him to grow up and become a man who can not only protect himself, but also help others. Kofi was no longer the boy who suffered from bullying. He had become a man who could change his life and take control of it. And although new challenges lay ahead of him, he was ready to face them with his head held high. After Kofi gained confidence and learned to control his emotions, he realized it was time to give back to his abusers for what they had done to him. But instead of acting brutally or violently, he decided to use his wits and new skills to demonstrate that he was no longer weak and defenseless. Kofi's revenge plan was based on putting his abusers in embarrassing and humiliating situations, but doing it in such a way that no one could suspect him of being involved. He knew that simple retaliatory aggression would only make his situation worse, so he decided to act with subtlety and finesse, using the qualities he had developed in the past months. The first thing Kofi began to do was to observe his abusers. He scrutinized their habits, weaknesses, and vulnerabilities, studying when and where they were most vulnerable. These observations allowed him to draw up a detailed plan in which every step was calculated with precision. Kofi decided that the most effective way to retaliate would be to undermine their confidence and make them feel as vulnerable as they made him feel. He started with small pranks that at first glance seemed random. For example, one of his most bullied bullies suddenly discovered that his belongings kept disappearing from his school locker and then showing up in the most unexpected places. This caused him not only irritation but also fear that someone was purposely bullying him. The other bully, Kofi, decided to teach the other bully a lesson using the athletic skills he had developed over the past few months. In gym class, when they played team games, Kofi began to deliberately create situations that made his opponents look weak and clumsy. He displayed agility and speed that made them appear slow and awkward against the backdrop of his own successes. This not only diminished their credibility in the eyes of other classmates, but also undermined their self-confidence. But the most important element of his revenge plan was the use of creativity. Kofi knew that the power of art lay not only in its ability to express emotion, but also in the effect it could have on others. He began creating drawings and caricatures that, albeit in veiled form, depicted his abusers in funny and humiliating situations. He would leave these drawings in prominent places at school, leaving no trace that could lead back to him. Classmates seeing these works would laugh at the characters depicted, and Kofi's abusers would feel their authority being destroyed. His plan culminated in one unexpected event that he orchestrated using his analytical skills. He arranged for one of his main abusers to be the center of attention at a school assembly at the most inopportune moment. Because of his inattention and clumsiness, the offender found himself in a ridiculous position in front of the entire class and teachers. This incident became a cause for ridicule among his classmates for a long time, and his reputation suffered greatly. Kofi did not feel gloating that his plan had begun to work. Instead, he felt satisfaction that he had been able to restore justice and show everyone that he was not the weak and defenseless boy they thought he was. With his wits and new skills, he had not only managed to put his abusers in their place, but he had also given himself the opportunity to move on, putting past wrongs behind him. Amidst all the events that Kofi had carefully planned and implemented, the moment was approaching when he had to finally dot all the I's and T's. He chose the most appropriate event for this purpose, a school sports tournament, which was a significant event for the whole school. Teams from different classes participated in this tournament, and the competition always attracted the attention of students and teachers alike. Kofi knew that this event would be the perfect setting for his final confrontation with his offenders. He wanted not just to show his superiority, but to do so in front of the entire school community to dispel any last doubts about his strength and determination. The tournament provided such an opportunity. It was not words but actions that decided everything. A few days before the tournament, the atmosphere in the school was heating up. Everyone was discussing the upcoming competition, and each class was eager to field the strongest competitors. Kofi, who had proven his endurance and strength in gym class over the past few months, joined his team. His classmates, who were used to his former timidity, now saw a completely different person in front of them, confident and determined. When the day of the tournament came, Kofi was ready. He realized that this was his chance to end his humiliation once and for all and prove that he was not a weakling. When the competition began, he focused on each stage, giving his best. His main rivals were the same guys who had previously made his life unbearable. Now they were standing opposite him on the field, and you could see the tension in their eyes. They realized that this tournament would not be easy for them. The first stage of the competition was the short distance race. Kofi, having trained for the past few months, had turned running to his advantage. When the starting signal sounded, he rushed forward, leaving his opponents far behind. His movements were confident and powerful, his every step precise and powerful. The crowd erupted in applause when he crossed the finish line first, far ahead of everyone else. The next test was the team tug-of-war. This was a team game requiring not only strength but also cohesion. Kofi, realizing the importance of this stage, took on the role of his team leader. He inspired and supported his comrades, guiding their efforts. When the confrontation reached its peak and the rope began to shift towards the opponents, Kofi gathered all his strength and, tensing every muscle, made a decisive leap, leading his team to victory. It was symbolic. In front of the entire school, he defeated those who had once tried to break his spirit. But the real highlight of the tournament was the final competition, the soccer match, which was always the key event of the day. Kofi found himself in the spotlight when two teams collided on the field, his team and a team made up of those very same offenders. From the first minutes of the game, it was clear that this was going to be a brutal confrontation. Kofi utilized everything he had learned over the past months. His speed, strategy and team spirit allowed him to effectively outmaneuver his opponents and create chances for his team. The climax of the match came in the final minutes when the score was tied and the tension was at its peak. Kofi, having received the ball in his own half of the field, rushed forward, passing one opponent after another. Every step he took was precise, every maneuver well thought out. As he approached the goal, the crowd froze in anticipation. His attackers, realizing that this moment could decide the outcome of the game, tried to stop him, but Kofi was faster and stronger. As if seeing in front of him all the humiliation he had to endure, he gathered all his determination and, without flinching, shot the ball into the goal. This goal was not just a victory in the game, but a symbolic end to his struggle. The crowd erupted in applause, and even those who had not noticed Kofi before now looked at him with respect. His abusers stood back, stunned not so much by his defeat in the game, but by the realization that they could no longer humiliate and control him. Kofi was no longer a victim, he had become a winner. After the game, Kofi felt an extraordinary calm. He realized that he no longer needed to prove anything to others. This moment was his triumph, and he had proven to himself that he was capable of much. His abusers now knew that Kofi was not someone to be humiliated and persecuted. He had emerged victorious not only on the field but also in life, and that was his greatest reward. After the triumphant conclusion of the sports tournament in which Kofi had won, his life at school changed dramatically. This day, filled with excitement and drama, was a turning point for him, and played a key role in changing his social standing in his new school. His success was not only a testament to his physical ability and confidence, but also a symbol of inner strength and resilience. Immediately after the tournament, Kofi noticed that his classmates began to treat him differently. Those who had previously bullied him and tried to humiliate him now looked at him with respect and acceptance. It was like an instant transformation in their attitudes. The bullies themselves, who had experienced defeat, began to feel their own position of authority shaken. They saw how Kofi was able to use his strength and skills to overcome obstacles, and it left a deep impression on them. The school that had previously seemed hostile and unfriendly to Kofi now began to open its doors. He began to notice that he was no longer shunned in the corridors, but rather greeted with a smile. Boys who used to tease him about his accent and clothes now sometimes came up to him to ask about how he was training or how he was so successful. It wasn't just a greeting, it was a genuine recognition of his accomplishments and personal qualities. Immediately after the tournament, many classmates began seeking his company. He became a more prominent figure in the class, and this was a result of his active participation in sports and competitions. People started approaching him with offers to join various school clubs and activities. Kofi found that he now had the ability to choose what he wanted to do, and this was incredibly important to him. Being involved in clubs gave him the chance to develop his interests and abilities, as well as finding common topics to socialize with new friends. Because of his new position, Kofi was able to connect with other students who were previously out of his social circle. He began spending time with those who shared his interests and hobbies. These new friends not only helped him adapt to the school environment, but also supported him during difficult times. They not only accepted him for who he was, but also helped him develop and grow. Kofi felt that he was no longer just one of many, but a full part of a new community. Over time, his relationship with his teachers also got much better. Previously, teachers might have overlooked him or perceived his problems as unimportant, but after his success at the tournament, they began to take an interest in his progress and activities. Kofi became more confident and, thanks to the new respect from his classmates and teachers, was able to demonstrate his abilities and knowledge in class. His academic success became as significant as his achievements in sports. Teachers began to recognize his efforts and accomplishments, which also contributed to his positive perception at school. This new life at school also brought Kofi a sense of inner satisfaction and confidence. He felt that he had overcome his fears and insecurities and was now an active participant in the school community. This confidence allowed him to begin to look forward to the future with hope and optimism. Kofi was no longer the boy who fears bullies and tries to hide from them. He became a person who embraces challenges and uses his strengths to accomplish goals. Instead of isolation and loneliness, he became part of a group where his opinions and ideas are valued. He learned how to build healthy relationships with others and realize how important it is to have support during difficult times. The recognition he received was not only external proof of his success, but also internal proof of his growth and development. His position in school now changed dramatically. He was no longer an object of ridicule and bullying, but a person whose opinion was listened to and whose accomplishments were admired. Kofi accepted his new role with dignity, realizing that it was not only the result of his efforts, but also an opportunity for further development and self-improvement. The past of humiliation and fear was behind him, and Kofi looked to the future with confidence. He knew that every hardship passed and every challenge overcome had made him stronger and wiser. He was now ready to take on new challenges, build relationships and achieve even greater successes, knowing that inner growth and personal strength were his main allies.